Good evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Dale Keefe, Provost and Vice President Academic at Acadia University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to what is the third in a series of debates between Dr. Paul Abela and Dr. Anna Robbins. I viewed the other two, or most of the other two, videos online, and I really encourage you to check them out. I know you are going to be in for a very entertaining and informative evening. One of the roles of a university is to challenge mindsets and to debate ideas. This doesn't mean, as too often we see today, that every idea is valid as long as one simply says they choose to believe it. One needs to present and defend their ideas and respond to challenges from others of differing viewpoints. This is exactly what we're going to have tonight. We will have two individuals who have a very different worldview present their arguments and respond to challenges from the other. It's exactly how we advance, and it's one of the core principles of a free society. While we enjoy this debate tonight, we should be fully aware that there are many societies where this type of event would not be allowed. For this evening, the participants have decided that Dr. Abela will go first, and then Dr. Robbins will follow. Each participant will have 25 minutes to present their position, and then they will have 5 minutes to respond to each other. I'll sort of give them a warning when they have about 5 minutes left. In the interest of getting right to the debate, I will keep the introductions fairly short. Dr. Paul Abela is a member of the philosophy department at Acadia. He holds a BA from the University of Toronto, an MA from Queen's University, and a Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford. His area of specialization is the Enlightenment. He also does research and teaching in philosophy of science and the environment. He has published and presented previously on issues that arise from the productive tension between religion and contemporary atheism. Dr. Anna Robbins serves as president of the Acadia Divinity College and Dean of Theology for Acadia. A two-time graduate of Acadia, she completed a PhD in theology and social ethics at the University of Wales and served on the faculty of the London School of Theology for 12 years. She returned to Acadia in 2012 and was appointed the 7th president of the Acadia Divinity College last year. She teaches, writes, and speaks widely on matters of Christian faith in contemporary Western contexts. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Dr. Paul Abela.
Okay, I'm just going to get the PowerPoint up and running. Okay, first I'd like to thank Dale for that wonderful introduction. And as he mentioned, it's a privilege to be able to have debates on this subject in this country and at this university. So I'd like to thank you again for the opportunity. I'd like to thank Anna again for participating in round 3 of what's been an engaging and I found very informative exchange over the last 2, and I'm sure today will be as well. The past 2 debates, in the first debate we were sort of debating the existence of God, in the second we were debating issues about meaning from a theist or atheist perspective. So I'm going to assume from those 2 debates, for my purposes, that I've demonstrated that belief in God is not well warranted, and that it's entirely possible to have a meaningful life without commitments that are theistic. Today, we're going to be engaging each other on the question of transcendence. And obviously, that's somewhat connected to issues about meaning. There will be a little bit of overlap. But I'm interested to sort of steer at least my part of our engagement towards a kind of frame of reference question with respect to transcendence. I think the religious worldview and, as you'll see, the scientific worldview both can create a kind of veneration for, or better yet, can create a framework in which we think of ourselves as fundamentally at home in the world. And I'm going to argue that an atheist perspective, in fact, creates a different frame of reference. And it's a frame of reference, in fact, in which once we've cast off what I take to be the false beliefs, the palliative beliefs of religion, and we don't transport those back into a scientific worldview, which I'll explain in the context of the presentation, that we're left with a kind of estranged picture of human beings in a world that is in many ways antithetical to human flourishing. So I think in that respect, atheism, in giving up on transcendence, creates a picture of the human condition, which is one of homelessness. And I'm going to develop that. It's a disquieting way of thinking about atheism. Most contemporary atheists tend to be triumphalist. They tend to think that they're just going to displace religion with an equally sweet song. I think there's certain kinds of costs that come with atheism, and I don't think we should shy away from them. So I'm going to try to develop that theme in the context of a discussion about transcendence or the absence of transcendence. Okay. So just to set this up in terms of, as I say, where this is going at the end, where I want to get to, is a certain sense that with the death of God, I think we begin to think of human beings in the universe in terms of a kind of story of being a kind of cosmic orphan. And in that sense, as I say, we have to give up the idea that we're at home in the world. And I think this is just a short passage from the philosopher and theologian Pascal, a very interesting figure in the Catholic tradition, who said, man is equally incapable of seeing the nothingness from which he emerges and the infinity in which he is engulfed. And of course, Pascal had a theistic response to that, one that I don't think is any longer tenable. So instead, I think there's a certain kind of part of the Pascalian story, a very sharp-edged, stark part of the Pascalian story, that I think can be brought into full view and to some degree, although I'm not going to say much more about Pascal. You may get the flavor of it over the next 20 minutes. Okay, just move on to the next slide. So I guess like a good philosopher, we should have a little bit of a definitional look at what are we talking about when we talk about transcendence. And I'm not going to get into the Oxford definition of transcendence. I don't want to trade dictionary definitions, but I want to at least get a couple of things up. I think transcendence is more than a feeling. I think the feeling of transcendence is a kind of affective state, and it gets cashed out in different ways. Oftentimes it's a sense of awe and wonder. And I think this is available both to religious traditions and also to non-religious traditions. So there's nothing I'm going to say today that's going to in any way decrease your appreciation of a wonderful Nova Scotia sunset, or looking at great works of art, or thinking about other similar matters that involve a certain sense of awe and majesty. And as I say, I think historically, religion has expressed the awe and majesty of creation, and it's done that for a very long time. I, as I say, think that story is coming to an end, culturally at least, but I think science can do a very good job with that story. I don't think there's any problem in trying to understand that affect we have. And clearly there's a kind of sublimeness to experience, which again, I think is, if we're thinking about natural beauty, or we're thinking about something like music, for example, there's all sorts of moments where we just feel a kind of affective transcendence, that we're pulled out of the moment, and we feel a kind of unboundedness. And they're rare, and they happen and they disappear. They're ephemeral. But the fact that they come in and out doesn't make the affect any less real. And I think both theists and atheists can be attentive to that, and we don't need to give up on the affective notion of the sublime. Another way of trying to capture this notion of a feeling, this is Freud back in the 1920s and 1930s with the notion of the transcendent as a kind of oceanic feeling, which was actually something Freud got out of an exchange of letters with another writer. But the basic sense of it was this notion of unboundedness, that the affect of transcendence is a feeling of without limit. And of course, Freud had his own uniquely Freudian story to explain that, which I'm not really interested in. One stab at it, I don't know, 80 years on, how much credence that we would give to it. But there are other ways of experiencing this notion of a kind of oceanic feeling. Certainly, and I'm not recommending what I'm about to describe, I'm just describing it. But it was certainly the case that, there have been people like Aldous Huxley and others with the Doors of Perception, for example, in the early 1960s, taken on by people like Timothy Leary, who said, drugs were as a way of expanding the mind and opening up yourself to the transcendent. And certainly you do see in certain religious traditions the use of certain kinds of substances as a way of getting in touch with the transcendent. So that, for me, again, is a story about a feeling, but I don't want to say a feeling is an unreal thing. A feeling's a real thing. I just don't think that's really what we want to talk about today. That's to say, I don't think transcendence is just about a feeling. So I think transcendence more to do with what in philosophy we would call ontology, which is something that the nature of being, the reality of it, as opposed to the affect we get in a feeling. So in that sense, when I'm talking about transcendence, I'm talking about an experience, not a feeling, an experience of being at one with the world. Or sometimes people capture this notion as no separation between my being and all that is. Now, in religious language, and I'm obviously going to leave this to Anna, I'm not an expert in this area, so I'm giving a very quick one-paragraph gloss for just immediate purposes. But I think in religious language, certainly in the Abrahamic traditions, a notion of reunion with God is a fundamental part of the ontology of transcendence, a return to a creator. And in some sense, we're part of creation, we belong to creation, we have a home in creation, and redemption is a story of a kind of return. In that sense, we are always at home in the world. Hinduism, Jainism have a return to the source of primordial being. So they may not have the creator story, but they have a story, another kind of story of a return and of a being in a certain sense at home in the world. Buddhism's a little different, but again, it looks to the sage as someone who transcends the world of suffering, and in that sense offers a path to a kind of redemption, a path to being at home in the world. So in all of those cases, I think contingency and finitude, which mark our empirical experience, are in some sense pulled out into a deeper reality. And I think that's fundamental to what we mean when we're talking about the ontology of transcendence. And if you think, again, in some of the Abrahamic traditions, a day of judgment, or in other, perhaps Eastern traditions, a notion of reincarnation, or in the Buddhist tradition of liberation through a discipline, all of these speak to transfiguring our lives in the transcendent, and in that sense, making ourselves whole. So part of what Anne and I are talking about in the title of this evening is this idea of transcendence in terms of a lived reality. So I'm talking about ontology, but I'm really wanting to focus on the sort of lived experience of being at home or not being at home in reality. Okay, I think there's sort of two forms of enchantment. Religious worldview, which offers a conception of reality that's saturated with spiritual meaning. I think a nice, quick way of trying to capture that is the idea that reality is an artifact. It's not a thing, right? It's like if you walk on the beach and you find a rock, that's a thing. If you walk on the beach and you find a watch, that's an artifact. It's infused with meaning and purpose, and it has function, and the function reflects structure, and the structure reflects intention. So the religious worldview is a worldview where reality is enchanted and saturated with meaning at all of its joints, and even the unpleasant parts. In some sense, you want to say, well, it's part of God's plan. Another version of enchantment is what I'm going to call a form of nature worship, that nature itself is intrinsically saturated with meaning, so you don't have to go through God here, you go right to nature. And all of the sort of uncomfortable finiteness and contingency can be dissolved if somehow we get back to the pulse of nature. Okay, so I want to talk first about the first one, religious disenchantment, and I'm going to be pretty quick here because we've talked about this in the previous debate. So again, this is in some sense just a reminder. I think with the accelerating decline of religion comes a consonant decline with the ontology that supports religious transcendence. So I think stripped of otherworldly commitments like God and souls and rebirth, there just is no transcendence. Without the ontology, there's nothing underneath, there's nothing substantive to ground an argument for transcendence. And I don't think fuzzy spiritualism is a response. Some people say, well, people are moving away from organized religion, but they're just very spiritual now. Well, the polling data doesn't actually suggest that the displacement, that's to say the drop in organized religion, is entirely taken up with spiritualism or forms of spiritualism. There are more people who say, well, I'm spiritual, but don't put me in a box. But in terms of absolute numbers, you see absolute number growth of atheists and agnostics, not people who belong to this group. And I'm not going to defend the claim, I'm just going to assert it rather baldly, but I think this form of spiritualism is more this sort of shatter dust of something that's falling down, as opposed to something that's going to build something else back up. Okay, so in the religious context, a world without transcendence as it fades out is a kind of displacement story. You're not refuting religion, it's getting displaced. So I think someone like Max Weber, who kind of, and I'm not going to read this slide, I'll leave it to you to read it, but he sort of was really one of the first in the early part of the 20th century to give us this kind of picture of disenchantment, that as religious belief drops away and a story that's mysterious and, as he describes it, magical, disappears, it's replaced with a scientific story of reason where we understand the mechanisms for how things work. And in that sense, mystery gives way to technical means and calculation. And hence, in that way, the world and creation becomes disenchanted. It's no longer saturated with meaning. It becomes like the rock as opposed to the watch on the beach. Now, the second version, and this is perhaps the novel part of my presentation, for those who've heard atheists and theists chat on about transcendence, is I think there's another version of transcendence that's baked into some of the scientific approaches to nature. And I'm equally critical of these. So in that sense, I'm something of a critic of naturalism, insofar as naturalism can at times, I think unknown to itself, become impregnated with a kind of second order transcendence, which it should purge. It's a creeping back of a certain religious impulse into naturalism, although I know many naturalists would deny that. So the sort of veneration of nature as a vehicle of transcendence, I think, is as bad. In fact, I'd say it's worse than the irrationalism of religious magic thinking. So in that sense, Lucretius, now we're rolling it all the way back to the 1st century BC, a Roman writer who wrote a very important book, which disappeared for about 1,000 years and was found again, called The Nature of Things. It was arguably a kind of atheist, what we would now think of as an atheist book, celebration of Epicurean materialism. But it is intoxicated with a celebratory character. It's a poem, and it's a poem that's full of a kind of reverence for nature. We get a similar kind of tone in works of some of the contemporary new atheists, for example, Richard Dawkins. Dawkins' Unweaving the Rainbow is a wonderful book, and I'd recommend reading it. It's a great read. I think it's one of his best works. But in that text, Dawkins is also interested in a kind of celebratory account of nature. I'm just going to catch up on my slides here. So the quotation that he uses for the book is from the poet Keats, who was chastising, or at least needling, the Newtonian worldview, whereas the poet was arguing this sort of takes the rainbow apart, it unweaves it, it takes the poetry out of our understanding of nature. And one of the things Dawkins is fundamental about is reintroducing the poetry of nature understood scientifically. The language Dawkins uses for the poetry of nature is this celebratory account. He, of course, notes the hard edges. I mean, he's a biologist and a very important theoretician in biology. But the tone of Dawkins' approach is one which I think, ironically, borrows the frame of transcendence and draws it into science. And I think that's a concession to the religious worldview that shouldn't be made. And again, we have this, of course, Dawkins is himself is an expert in this field, but I'm just going to draw your attention to it. This is a slide I used previously. I got one or two here that I've taken over from the last to use in this context. We actually think of nature in terms of what we know, in terms of Darwin. It's a slaughterhouse. It's an animated slaughterhouse. Most of it goes on out of sight and out of mind, thankfully, because I don't know psychologically if we could take the pressure of it. We see a very small part of it. This is, of course, a picture of an example Darwin gives himself of a wasp laying its eggs in the living body of a caterpillar with predictable results. And I think I also mentioned this in the last presentation. This is from Huxley, Thomas Huxley, not Aldous Huxley, who would have been his great-grandson. And here, I'm not going to read it. You can have a look at it. But again, his point is if we look at nature, what we find in nature is really a kind of horror story. And if animals and all the beasts that we're subject to, nature, if we could hear them, he says it would end in one continuous scream. If we think about the scale of nature, so now talking about biological nature, but if we're talking about physical nature, and I wonder if I could just get a quick time check. All right, I've got a couple of minutes, so I'll be attentive. I'll try not to go on too much here. In terms of scale, so if we're not just thinking about the sort of slaughterhouse in terms of biology, but we're saying, well, where are we in the physicality of the world? Okay, we're not at the center of the universe. We can give up on that old religious worldview, but it isn't just we're not at the center. I mean, that's far too mild a description. If we want to think about just our solar system, just if I'm reading out from the sun, I'll keep Pluto in. I know there's some debate. But if we take the sun out to Pluto, we're looking at about 5.9 billion kilometers. If we look at the Milky Way, so the galaxy that our solar system is in, and now I'm going to move, of course, from kilometers to light years, as I say, the distance light travels in a year. It's about between 170 and 200,000 light years in diameter. That's one galaxy in a universe. And the universe in scale with respect to diameter is about 93 billion light years across. We're one little uninteresting speck in all of that. If you look at the age, about 14 billion years old. Human beings as a species have been around for only 100,000 years. If you thought about that, if you thought about the amount of time not a human being lives, but the species, let's say 100,000 years out of Africa, it would be like 1 day in 383 years. So if you're looking at time scale, it isn't just that the world isn't 4,000 and some odd years old. Of course, no one except the most fundamentalist Christian would believe that. I know Anne, of course, doesn't. But in terms of scale, we are less than a temporal speck. I'm going to move through this one quickly. You've seen this one before. Again, it's just Buzz Aldrin, who was the second man to get to the moon. And although he was a religious man. He was a Presbyterian. In fact, he brought a communion service with him. And while Neil Armstrong was about to go out on the moon, one small step for man, one giant leap, Buzz Aldrin was having a religious. He was breaking bread and drinking wine, which isn't well known. But that didn't keep him when he got on the moon. The very first thing he said when he looked around was magnificent desolation. So I think when you're thinking about what comes out of a scientific understanding of the world, if you resist impregnating it with secondhand transcendence from religion, there's a price to be paid in understanding reality from a scientific standpoint. And I think the price that you pay is you absolutely give up on the idea of transcendence. And here in the last 3 or 4 minutes, then I'll just introduce the last theme, homelessness. So this is, I guess, the more unique part. And I think of this more as a tonic. I know you might say, my goodness, this talk's a rather dark talk. It's a rather poisonous talk, but sometimes just a little bit of poison can be a tonic. It can be bracing. And I guess that's the tone in which I want to talk a bit about homelessness. I think with the death of God, we find ourselves as orphaned creatures. Science tells us that the reality is in its unfathomable temporal and spatial extension deeply hostile to human life. And in that sense, we're not just merely not at the center of creation. That's just far too mild. We are rather a peculiar freak of nature. Love, compassion, generosity, altruism, grace are unintended byproducts of a blind and bloody evolutionary species history. Even human reason, that engine of science and critical thinking, which has liberated us from the bad faith of the enchanted, magical religious world of thinking, may itself, it may turn out to be an evolutionary dead end. It's not impossible to think that rational creatures don't live as long as bacteria. Maybe we blow ourselves up. I mean, I hope we don't, but it's possible. So I think estrangement after religion and science, not either or, after religion and science. I think the lesson here is you can't go home. There is no natural fit between all that's best in us and the character of reality. So in the last 2 minutes then, I think moving beyond transcendence as lived experience, I think what marks us out then is solidarity. That we can mount a response to our predicament in terms of our shared condition. And I think in that way, humanism as solidarity is a kind of humanism in the face of a storm. If you want a good maritime example, it's that feeling you have 2 days before a hurricane hits, right? People have a sense of a kind of common situation, a common project, the importance of helping each other, all the things that are important to the human condition that distinguish us from the storm come out. And I think that's a nice way of trying to frame what a world looks like from the secular standpoint without transcendence, but with solidarity. In that sense, I think it's about crafting a kind of safe harbor, to use another kind of good maritime expression. Fashioning a microcosm in the macrocosm, to use a term from T.H. Huxley. At the last 2 years of his life, as he's not only, of course, an important scientist, Huxley was Darwin's bulldog, in case you're unfamiliar. He lived, I guess, about 12 or 13 years more than Darwin did. And at the end of his life, he was writing really interesting stuff in of all things, ethics. And he just began a kind of story about saying, the human project is a project of building a caring microcosm in the uncaring macrocosm of life. And I think that's a nice way of framing it. It hasn't got much developed in 100 years, but I think there's a lot baked into that. And of course, a lot more we know about nature in terms of not being at home in it. So the last point that I want to make is, in that sense, in the lived reality of a world without transcendence and a world of human solidarity, what we get are stolen moments of significance. It's not a communion with a deeper ontological reality. It's not a natural fit into a slot that's carved out for us. But instead, it's a wrenching from a barren world, drawing it up into something of great human value. And that seems to me a pretty inspiring and powerful way of thinking about what human experience can look like in a world where we give up transcendence in the religious and we don't bring it back into the scientific, but we find a kind of humanism that captures our common condition. Thank you. I think we got that in about 25 minutes. Okay, great. I've got everything out of your way there.
If you need anything, just give me a shout. Thanks for being here, Dale, and introducing the things that are going on tonight. Paul, thanks as always for the challenge. It's been so much fun, and I'm really glad that we have had the chance to do this again, because it grows out of other conversations that we have outside of this room. It causes me to do some work that I might otherwise not do, and to think in ways that I might not otherwise think. I always think of the theologian Paul Tillich, who talked about the importance of theology having some correspondence with philosophical terms so that we can have proper conversations about things that we might understand together. I don't pretend to be a philosopher. I am a theologian, and I think in categories that are slightly different, but I hope that we have at least enough in common in our categories that we can have a conversation that makes sense. And so at the outset, I'd like to clarify that although I represent theism in this encounter, I don't presume to speak for all theists. Although I would have some concerns in common with others, I'm a theist of a specifically Christian variety, and within that of the Canadian Baptist kind. So despite my specific location, or perhaps because of it, I would like to think that at least some of my observations are conditioned by a broader concern of Christians more generally and theists broadly, at least those who posit the existence of God, usually in the singular, and usually of the personal or interventionist kind. As a particular brand of theist, then I think it's important that I also define what I mean by transcendence. Theologian Michael Ray, in his book on the hiddenness of God, it represents his 2017 Gifford Lectures, he describes attending a church for the first time as a 4-year-old. Regaled with stories about the house of God, he went with great expectation of seeing a light and hearing a voice. But God seemed to be neither in the light nor in the voice. The owner of the voice seemed to be none other than the man on stage, he writes, and that man seemed to be old and balding, unlike the pictures of Jesus I had seen in the halls. By the end of the service, I concluded that God had skipped church. The mysterious house of God had turned out, after all, to be quite familiar and ordinary. Now, as a Christian theist, I would wish to affirm that God is everywhere and there is no escaping the divine presence. However, like Ray, I would also want to affirm that God is everywhere, but God is not anywhere in the way that a child might expect, in the way described. We don't find God sitting in our sanctuaries. She does not inhabit the light. He does not speak with a voice for all to hear, not to most of us anyway. And seeing no signs of God up in the heavens or down in the depths, many question God's existence, receiving no tangible guidance from God and finding no divine hand to hold them fast in times of trial. Not a few people then question God's real presence and God's love, given that presence is surely a sign of love. Transcendence then is to be understood in contrast and alongside the idea of immanence. God is somehow proximate, yet simultaneously and paradoxically also far off. Transcendence then speaks of God's otherness or alterity, the ways that God is different from humanity and the rest of the created world. It affirms that God is not material nor contained within the material world, standing outside of space-time and yet somehow connected with it. Nor is God constrained by the material world. Another aspect of transcendence is God's inscrutability. That is, that God is infinite and cannot be known by the finite, except insofar as God reveals God's self to humanity. And so here it should be acknowledged lies a spectrum of views. But that's enough definition, I think, for now to at least to continue. The topic at hand is one perhaps less of esoteric metaphysical speculation and one more of the practical side of living life here and now. What then is the relevance of affirming a transcendent God in the course of our lives today? This is, of course, a concern for values and ethics as well as for meaning, which is, as you heard from Paul, what we discussed in our previous encounter. We're well aware that living as human beings in the world today, there are some issues that seem to impugn God's existence. Very practically, we ask, how could a loving God allow my relative to die a horrible death? How could a powerful God allow a tsunami that kills hundreds of thousands? Why doesn't God stop the pandemic? The ages-old rebellion against the transcendent emerges as though we have the absolute right to question the infinite. Yet, God allows it. Either God is not loving or God is not powerful. In either case, we're left with a transcendent being we wish not to know. We're left with problems of theodicy, that is justifying God in the face of suffering, and the hiddenness of God. Philosopher Charles Taylor has traced this shift in mindset in the Western world and observed that we have, on the whole, thrown off this cloak of transcendence. and opted for the significance of the material. The near inevitability of rejecting a transcendent God who is powerful and loving emerges from a rational modernity that leaves for God only those things we cannot provide for ourselves, like cancer and tsunamis. The rest of life we have learned to provide for ourselves very well. So if God can't sort out the big things that we have left for God, what is the point? We're left with immanence, a sense that this is all there is. And let's be honest, there may be a great sense of relief in letting go immediately, but in the long run, we tend to experience immanence, solely immanence, as a malaise. And the current malaise that we encounter in our culture is marked out by distraction, a lack of focus. There's a world weariness in the face of a world that seems so far out of control. Maybe for a while we thought we controlled everything, but that illusion has been burst like an overfilled birthday balloon with the emergence of a global pandemic. We control so little. The current malaise is marked by a turn to nostalgia, a looking backwards for meaning because we can't see where we're going. We hang on to memories that bring comfort rather than turn our desire towards the future, the unknown, the risky. The malaise we experience is meh, where things don't really matter. Value lies only in preference, and hope fades into hopelessness. What we fail to realize, however, is that this desire that we have, a desire for the way things ought to be that aren't, I agree with Paul, that itself, that feeling is not transcendence. But perhaps unlike Paul, I think that we have this sense for a reason, because it points to a transcendence. An atheist cannot really ask the question that as a theist I often hear from people when bad things happen, where is your God? In the face of tragedy, this is only a question for a person of faith. There can be no expectation that the world ought to be one way or another if you do not believe in transcendence or transcendent value, as C.S. Lewis would suggest. The world is simply then as we find it. But Lewis also suggested that we have this desire as humans. He uses the German Sehnsucht to describe it. This is a sign of transcendence as much as it is inherent in what it means to be human. Sehnsucht, nostalgia, it's a desire for something, but we know not what. But we feel it. We feel it as a sense of wonder at a sunset. Those things you were describing, Paul, this deep pain when we see something so beautiful, we wonder how the world can sustain it. Sehnsucht comes with a powerful longing that the world is too beautiful, too fragile, too fleeting. Nostalgia is a flock of geese at dawn, a full moon shining on an open field, childhood memories of Christmas and school days that were always sunny. Yet hard as we try, we can never get these moments back, and the longing is never fulfilled. We end up confusing the desire of the thing for the thing itself and seek therefore endlessly to replicate past joy. And the feelings these memories conjure up are gold when our current reality seems so drab by comparison. Well, some meaning can come from the fleetingness of these moments, but here we're directing that desire backwards, not forwards. The desire is actually a desire for the transcendent, encountered in the material, but never exhausted within it. It continues to seek until it finds its rest in God, St. Augustine. This God-given desire for God, for transcendence, is suppressed by focusing on the finality of things rather than in the giver of life itself. Such a view is that of Martin Hägglund, an atheist philosopher at Yale and the author of This Life, Secular Faith and Spiritual Freedom. In essence, Hägglund argues that because life is finite, it has value. There's no freedom in the persistence of eternity. Only the temporality of life gives freedom and responsibility. But contrast this with a view of humanity that holds in dialectic the qualities of both immanence and transcendence. Because transcendence doesn't only involve God, it involves people and the whole of creation for that matter. Because a transcendent God is also immanent. The whole of reality is imbued with inherent value. For human beings, following Kierkegaard and Reinhold Niebuhr, we are both immanent and transcendent. And like Hägglund, Niebuhr would say that people are finite, dependent on the world for our material breath, for our breath, our survival, our physical well-being. Human beings need material sustenance, and yes, they will die. Yet in the face of this existentialist threat, Niebuhr, like Kierkegaard, affirms that humans are material, yet also spirit. The two are not usually appreciated with equal sympathy, writes Niebuhr. The obvious fact is that humans are children of nature, subject to its vicissitudes, compelled by its necessities, driven by its impulses, and confined within the brevity of the years which nature permits its varied organic form. He goes on to indicate the other less obvious fact that humans are also spirits who stand outside of nature, life, themselves, their reason, and the world. This dialectic presents a problem for humanity, which leaves us as unintegrated selves if the separation between these realities is not healed. We fall into one of two errors. One is that in seeing beyond the limits of our nature, we embrace an illusion that by being able to see the whole of reality, we are somehow the whole of reality. In other words, we become enamored by our spiritual selves and our connection to the transcendent to imagine that we are ourselves the transcendent. And then we deny our frailty, our finiteness, our materiality. We take power over one another and seek to extend our view of things, that finality, into infinity. This is illusion, because still we will die. On the other hand, when we deny that we are spiritual and have a transcendent aspect to the self, we deny our ability to accomplish or achieve anything of lasting significance. We deny the perspective we can have on life that stretches beyond the present restrictions and hide away in self-pleasure, self-amusement, and self-delusion. As for Kierkegaard, a true self is made when we take that risk of faith, which is in some ways itself paradoxical, but we learn to embrace human existence as the tension between these two realities. The transcendent, then, is what gives meaning and value to the material. The material can accept and extend its finiteness by accepting its limits. In turn, it limits the pretensions of the transcendent within humanity and reminds us of our frailty. Some time ago, this was long before pandemic days, I downloaded an app to my phone called We Croak. I had read about it in The Atlantic and wanted to try it for myself. Weary of all the fuss about mindfulness apps that encourage you to slow down and breathe in the middle of the day, this one promised something different. The We Croak app buzzed my phone randomly 5 times each day with a simple message: don't forget, you're going to die. It's based on the premise of a Bhutanese mindfulness that to be happy, you need to contemplate death 5 times a day. It's a mindfulness memento mori, if you will. This We Croak app reminded me of the artwork of classical masters who would paint a skull somewhere on their canvas, just to remind the viewer that we do not have forever. We don't encounter that reminder quite so often in contemporary culture, until recent days probably, where we delude ourselves that we will go on like this for eternity. And so, as a theologian emerging from a period of existential angst at the time, during which I was reminding everybody around me that regularly, actually, that we are going to die, we're going to die, wearily, I thought this app was just the thing for me. One early morning, I was lying in bed with the sun streaming through the window, cuddling my 9-year-old son before we had to get up for school and work. My phone buzzed with a message. I was tired, but I lifted the screen to my eyes and read, "Don't forget, you're going to die." With each buzz, I had the opportunity to click for a quote. I yawned and clicked. Today, it was the artist Frida Kahlo. Nothing is absolute. Everything changes. Everything moves. Everything revolves. Everything flies and goes away. I recalled something I'd read recently about how one day when you pick up your son and hug him, it's the last time you pick him up and you won't even know or remember. And I didn't remember. I hugged him a little more tightly and said, "Someday you won't want to cuddle me anymore." And he cuddled me tighter still. "Oh, yes, I will, Mom. I will always want to cuddle you. I will cuddle you forever." My phone buzzed. Don't forget. I put it down and decided to ignore it for then, just for now. I'll pretend we have forever. You see, even though I believe in the transcendent, I too can experience the Sehnsucht that Lewis describes in the everyday. Hagler mistakenly thinks that the concept of eternity means there's no disruption between this world and the next. And I think this is a misunderstanding of transcendence as I, as a theist, would understand it. Disruption does mean an end, even if there is a new beginning beyond it. It's not simply a continuity of all that is into eternity. The thing that is continuous into eternity from a human perspective is the relationship with God, the connection with the transcendent, spirit to spirit, yet enfleshed. The greater continuity is perhaps that experienced by God's self. Because of transcendent and God's alterity, we can't really access that. But living in light of these affirmations means that value is not found in the mere fact of the temporality of things, as some posit, though temporality may awaken us to their value. Rather, we value things and thus long for their continuity. We value things because they are inherent goods, material though they be, imbued with value from the transcendent, whom I would affirm ultimately as a relational God. Our spirits are what enable community with God and one another, even though that happens in the material world in the flesh. Transcendent relationality instills value that finality cannot. I wonder if those like Hagelin would reach the same conclusions if their lives experienced a greater deal of trauma, or if they were not so privileged. In a strictly material world, finality for those who suffer is relief. The value of their life is not because it's short. They have inherent dignity as those who bear the image of a transcendent yet present God. Again, the paradox. These values mark out our responsibilities in this life. Responsibilities demand response. And so we respond to the creative action of God by recreating. We respond to those around us in a movement of being responsible, even to the degree of the other's responsibility, as Emmanuel Levinas would suggest. That for a Christian, the appearance of the transcendent in the midst of the immanent heals the breach between the two. And in the self-giving cross, the transcendent pours itself out in servanthood. And so we are called to do the same. Resurrection rather than death has the last word, no matter how painful the experience. Yet there is disruption between the two. African-American scholar Barbara Holmes helps us to understand the relevance of the transcendent in the face of the worst kinds of suffering. She writes of the moan of prayer, and I couldn't help, Paul, when you were talking about the scream, the organic scream of this moan. She writes of the moan of prayer as she recalls the history of Africans who came to America on slave ships. Sometimes, she says, words will not come. And at times like this, the moan becomes the vehicle for articulating that which can never be voiced. Moans are the utterances of choice when circumstances snatch words and prayers from bereft lips, she writes. As bodies lay side by side in conditions unimaginable, eventually the only sound to be heard was moaning. As time went on, the moans from the slave ship's cargo hold lost their human sound, for there's no bodily response that could assuage or comfort, no sound that could fully express the horror. The moan became the first vocalization of a new spiritual vocabulary, terrible and wonderful. It was a cry, a critique, a prayer, a hymn, a sermon, all at once. The moan expressed loneliness, pain, and the inchoate hope, which would later fuse with biblical imagery. Its rhythm was not so much the syncopated beat of the West African drum as the rock and sway of the seafaring vessel which contained their bodies. Holmes points to how the moan became communal contemplation, the vehicle that carries the afflicted community towards transcendence. These are the sighs and groans of the spirit. The moan is a spirit song. The moan is a crisis contemplation. And the moan reminded the community that God was there, even though it seemed that in so many ways God had forsaken them. In a time of widespread death and isolation, the affirmation that we are never alone is more than comforting. It is life-sustaining. The thing about the expressed moan is that it's generative. The moan is the birthing sound. In the darkest night, the moan is heard. The moan is heard. And that hearing becomes the acknowledgement of pain that hopes for another world, a renewed creation. And could it be that in our troubled times, a moan to God is an expression of hope and we experience being heard? The value or responsibility here is not found then in our finality or fragility, but in the persistence of the soul in the face of violence. The choice to make a sound that says life is still here, and the response of God to the cry of the lost is an enduring hope in the face of hopelessness. So affirming a transcended eternity, I don't think provides an escape or an excuse. In some ways, it is a solace, but we don't believe it for those reasons. Nevertheless, I'm grateful for it. But contrary to Hagelin's view, it's not a loss of freedom. Rather, that's the only freedom available to the utterly dejected. In the moan where pain is seen and heard, in faith, we believe that justice will be done. For this world, it provides guidance for how we live our lives as humans and how we treat one another, listening to one another, making way for the inherent dignity of the other in the short time we have on this earth to work for justice, because that is what is valued by the transcendent. To love, because God is love. Remember how I opened with Michael Ray's story about being a child going to church? I couldn't help but close with these well-known words. When I was a child, I talked like a child, thought like a child, reasoned like a child. When he became a grown-up, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now, we see only in a reflection, as in a mirror. It's not clear. But then we shall see face to face. And now I know in part, and then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. Now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul and Anna. So we're going to let the participants, both will have the opportunity to ask the other a question, and they'll have about 5 minutes to respond. But while they're doing that, if you're watching online, feel free to type in a question in the chat if you in the comment section. And then when they're done, we will have an opportunity to have some questions, both from the ones that are here, the very few that are here under the current conditions, and then the ones that are online. So I don't know if you want to go first, Paul, or
ask you a question? Yeah. Okay. Is that speaker working okay? We're good? Okay. And I know you mentioned I think we have 5 minutes, so I won't hold you to a 5-minute answer. I could put in 2 questions and you could give me 2 quicker answers. There was a lot in your talk, and I should just mention for those who are watching the live stream that we hadn't seen each other's presentations beforehand, so we were sort of digesting them as we went. I wonder if I can just ask you, maybe the first question is a kind of clarifying question. I think one of the things that you mentioned with respect to one of the possible downsides for those who deny transcendence is that there can be in the absence of the transcendent, there can be a distorted sense of control, that we in the immanent frame may have a false extended conception of what we can do if there isn't the contrast with an infinite domain, which we call the transcendent. And so you framed that in a notion of control, and you reminded us that the current pandemic is a reminder of how things can get out of control and how little control we have. And I guess I was a little surprised by that argument. I mean, when I'm thinking about where we are right now with trying to control the pandemic, we're in a far more, as uncomfortable as it is, a far more comfortable place than when plagues went through Europe and the approaches were prayer, self-flagellation, holy water. So religious approaches to pandemics were not only unhelpful, but now we know, in fact, often made them worse. My sense of something like the pandemic, and of course, we're all in the middle of this one, And hopefully by this time next year, we will have vaccines and treatments that are better. And those will be demonstrably better because they will have been tested with canons of evidence and method. So I'm not as convinced that that the current situation is an argument against immanence and a reminder of transcendence because we overstate the notion of control. It seems to me when we're in a tough situation, we never have complete control, but we have scenarios that are better and worse. And I'd say the current one, which focuses entirely on the immanent with respect to, hope for trying 80 different vaccines and we have different tests for them, we'll find 1 or 2 or 3 that turn out to be effective and we can save hundreds of thousands of lives with it. So maybe you could just say a bit more about the transcendent and the notion of control.
Sure. Yeah. When I talk about transcendent and control, I'm really talking about how even those who are committed to transcendence actually overextend their view.
Right.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Okay.
So, I mistake the transcendence that I experience in my soul or as a human being.
Right.
I mistake that for the transcendent and seek to extend my life into infinity by extending my control.
Right.
And so I think as a culture, we largely do that, to be honest. And I think that theists have a lot to discuss in that realm very often. And I think we don't have to go very far to find where we could discuss that. So that comes as a self-critique as well as an observation, I would say. But having said that, when we look at the pandemic as an example, certainly when we talk about vaccines and all of those kinds of things, I agree with you. I mean, the scientific, the immanent, that's where we need to go with that.
Right.
It doesn't preclude people from praying,
No.
whatever that means and what that looks like. But there's another side to this, and that is the vast amount of death that has happened around the world. And that raises a whole other set of questions that I end up confronting quite often with folks. And the question, are we alone in that moment when there's no one there to hold your hand, I think it's more than a question of feeling. I think it's a very existential and ontological question, for which I would say in those moments that's where we start to see the aspect of transcendence really coming to play. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's clear to me. Maybe I can ask a second question if I still get within that 5-minute frame. You mentioned about one of the other things you mentioned about transcendence was the thought that it gave to value an enduring quality and that we hunger after that enduring quality. And in the absence of transcendence, there's something fundamentally at odds with what it is to be fully ourselves, whether we think it's fully human or embodied beings. And I guess one of the things I was pitching with my take on it is, in a certain sense, I don't agree with the premise, but I think I disagree with the conclusion. That to say, I agree that those in the immanent frame, as Taylor might sort of frame the issue, the language I'm using here is that value is a kind of value at its sharpest edge of stolen moments, that we have to sort of come to terms with the fact that the idea of something that is primitively enduring is something that has to be given up. And that's a difficult moment. And as I say, in sort of the language of stolen moments, what we can look to is a kind of solidarity in the character of human experience as we confront this. So there are resources, common resources, that we can mobilize in a sense of solidarity, but a recognition that there's no safety net underneath that. There's no transcendent domain in which those sharp edges are sandpapered off. We're at times we're cut and broken by them, and we only have one another to look to. So I guess in a certain sense, I'm not disagreeing with the premise. I just don't see the conclusion. That's to say, there must be a transcendent. It seems to me we could give up on the thought that the values would have the kind of enduring property that you're thinking they are required to have.
Yeah, well, I find it. Can I respond and also put a question?
Yes,
back
that was a good time to do
because I find it really interesting that you want to be able to find solidarity somehow in the immanent frame. Yes. Is that
yes,
fair?
no, yes, that is, yeah.
And yet you show us in every discussion a picture of the wasp laying eggs in the body of the caterpillar. Now, is that not nature's solidarity?
Well, I'll answer that. This is sort of the idea of the trying to build the microcosm within the macrocosm. For human beings, we have this unique capacity that we can create within our humanism a commitment to values of love, fellow feeling, generosity, altruism. Those are things we can establish through acts of will. We have that power. The rest of irrational nature does not. So we can create a microcosm which reflects that solidarity, and we can extend that out over time to other potential creatures within that sphere, circle of moral concern. So I guess for me, that's part of my argument, is that the idea that there's a home in nature, that somehow we should worship the macrocosm, is an appalling thought. And hopefully one that was chased off stage even with the domain of those who tried to turn science into ethics with eugenics 80 years ago. Clearly, we don't want to return to that. So I think the guiding thought for me is the humanist project, and it's an unapologetically humanist project. It isn't an attempt, which sometimes you get with certain forms of naturalism, sometimes even creeping into ethics within some forms of environmentalism, which the thought is, well, we're just evolved beings and our good is just going to be the good at the macroscopic, as we've described before, level. And I think, no, we've demonstrated a capacity to tend to the vulnerable, to stand through people's dark nights of the soul in an immanent frame, not just in a religious frame. So we have that capacity. It's demonstrable. There's evidence for it. The task, it seems to me, is to marshal that solidarity within the immanent frame to deliver it. And for me, that marks an ethic of humanism. Yeah.
I'm always interested, though, and this will probably return in some ways to something we've discussed before, but it's not resolved for me from trying to understand your perspective. So the idea that these things are goods and identified as goods, the things that you mentioned, grace, mercy, all those things, I find it very difficult to see where they come from. And I know, having done reasonably wide reading on it, I know there are those who argue that, well, they derive from the fact, as I mentioned, Martin Hagen, because we're finite, or someone else who says they're derived from the fact that we look how evolutionarily we have evolved and what strengths that brings to us and how we live together as community. I've seen some of the new atheists say that it's from studying our neurology and what fires off the happiness neurons. Mm-hmm. That's how we identify goods. And I've even heard Dawkins say that he's a humanist and identifies goods on the basis of being part of a post-Christian culture, mm-hmm. where those are the values, the C of E values in England are what he was raised on. And so therefore those are the goods. Mm-hmm. So why are these the goods? Yeah. Why not something else? Lewis said that we only know that what straight is if you've actually seen a ruler. And you don't know something's crooked unless you've seen something straight. So I always struggle with trying to understand why those values.
Sure. Well, I begin by saying that that's a kind of plague on all your houses, because which religious values are we going to espouse? There's a grab bag of competing ones. There's certainly ones, even different ones within a Christian tradition. There's different ones within the Abrahamic traditions. There's lots of variations, and of course, different values between the Abrahamic traditions and Eastern religions and indigenous sets of beliefs. And so, that's I think a very general worry, and clearly atheists have to answer it, as probably does every other a non-atheist group. I don't think there's any quick answers, and do I have 2 minutes left? No, I'm kidding. I can't possibly answer the question in 2 minutes. But clearly there's, within a philosophical tradition, there's lots of responses. You sort of introduced in a very general way a couple. If you thought that the moral good was framed around conditions of human flourishing, then you might well look to certain adaptive structures that we could map out scientifically and then talk about human flourishing. or you might have approaches that look more to reason and the conditions under which human judgment operates. So there's lots of traditions coming out of the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment that would look to certain universal properties that human beings have because we're beings that, unlike irrational animals, that can judge, and the conditions of judgment may well give frameworks for thinking about what's morally good and morally required. So we might have a language of duties and obligations that would come out of that. So there's no shortage of ways of thinking about moral value. There's lots of variations, I think, just like there are in religious traditions. I think that's a very general question. Yeah.
Just one more. Can I sneak in one more here?
Sure.
So when we look at the world at the moment, we're all quite distressed. It's the Western world. We often talk about, we're in a post-Christian Western world.
Mm-hmm.
Faith traditions are flourishing everywhere else in the world. Actually, this is our unique experience, Western Europe, North America, especially. I'm not sure we feel confident about the solidarity that you suggest. I think in Nova Scotia, we look at how solidarity has served us very well in the pandemic. It's absolutely stunning to watch. I would posit that's because we have such a latent Christianity in our culture. And there's a sense that people look out for each other. They will self-sacrifice for one another and so on, because this is certainly not the picture that we're getting everywhere else in the Western world at the moment, both with this issue and with many other things that are cooking. Solidarity just seems like a pipe dream in some ways. How do you respond to that?
Well, it seems to me there are other parts of the world that have been able to manage the pandemic in ways that aren't necessarily societies that are Christians. I don't see any unique pairing between Christian virtues and...
But not necessarily atheistic societies either.
No, but I mean, in many countries, atheists are not a majority. So I don't really know what the nature of that argument would be. But it seems to me there's a lot of variation even in European countries, and variation with respect to religious participation in many of those countries. I mean, you'd have to look at the numbers, but certainly I'd say I don't know that there's any kind of marked trend when I'm thinking about some of the Northern European countries with respect to how many people are actively Christian and how well they're doing with the pandemic. If you took Sweden and Norway and Finland, you'd see different stories that largely relate to different choices that they made early on with respect to how they thought about how to manage it, with varying degrees of deaths now in some of those countries. So I think you'll also see that if you look at Singapore or Hong Kong or mainland China or many varied countries. But I think maybe latent in the question was, does solidarity require a kind of, if not religious, a kind of cultural framework that provides the conditions under which people...
And does it become its own sense of transcendence? That solidarity, we're in it together. There's something bigger than me. There's, it becomes almost a substitute for transcendence in some way.
Well, bereft of any supernaturalism, I might not feel entirely uncomfortable with that conversation. It may end up becoming a little bit like Faber, if I may say, a displacement strategy for the supernatural version of transcendence, if you're willing to endorse a notion of solidarity that would essentially take the job applied to the religious view of transcendence and put it in the immanent. I might not feel completely uncomfortable with that displacement strategy.
I'd be uncomfortable with the degree of hope I would have in that system.
Okay.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So we'll turn to questions for Paul or Anna. I'll give the opportunity for anyone here if they want to ask first, and then we'll go to the online questions. Okay, go ahead.
We have some questions online.
Oh, great.
First, there's a comment here with a question in it, but it's from Greg, and he says, I so appreciate the constructive and respectful tone of the conversation. It's been such an important exchange. Can you speak about the differences between your perspectives in terms of the ground and extent of hope that you hold? Not hope for certain things to happen, but hope as rooted in the nature of reality itself, and the idea that human destiny fulfills or transcends anything that happens to us.
With both. So.
All right.
You can
Well,
start.
I'll start with something.
Yeah.
I mean, probably as a Christian, I should have some hope in humanity. I don't have an awful lot. Not a lot, because I know my own heart, right? And you know, God sees what is in a human heart. The reason I have hope, which I don't even work at, it's just there, comes as gift, and that is because of what I discussed previously in terms of my understanding of what is the nature of the transcendent and how the transcendent bears on this life. And unlike, you know, you read some fun books have funny descriptions of what they think Christians believe sometimes, and maybe Christians actually think some funny things sometimes. But the idea that our hope is because everything that is good about our lives now is going to continue forever, that is not a Christian hope. And so my hope is beyond the human experience, but I have hope for the human experience because I believe that the transcendent is at work within the human experience. Maybe we'll start with that. But
Do you want me to have a shot?
Yeah.
Are we filming?
mhm.
No, we are. Okay, is that okay? I mean, the topic today wasn't hope, but I think it does dovetail in with this to some degree. I mean, I don't want to overuse Steven Pinker's work, but I think Pinker presents a relevant case with respect to the data, with respect to human progress over time coming out of the Enlightenment. So if you're looking at sort of human well-being with sort of metrics of deaths through war, death through disease, including things like pandemics, if you look at rising levels of education, if you look at the capacity of women to have productive careers, I mean, if you look at a sort of a set of metrics with respect to things you associate with the improving human condition, what we've seen really over the last 100 years is a dramatic improvement in the human condition. Have there been backward moments? Yes, and you can map them. You can certainly see them in the First World War, the Second World War. You can see them in lots of wars that weren't world wars. You can see them in moments where disease flares up. But if you track them over long periods of time and you track them sensitive to ratios of people living in those times, so proportionality, you'll find over time a huge ramping up increase in human well-being. So does that mean it can't change tomorrow? No, that doesn't mean it can't. We have things that, if they got out of hand, could destroy the planet. We have tremendous Promethean power, which we've never had before. The 20th century brought us that, and it cuts in two directions. But if the question is, what kind of evidence do we have for hope for the future? I think there's pretty good evidence. And even in something like a pandemic, as you know, as serious as this pandemic is, of course, it's not as serious as past pandemics. If you, again, want to look at the data with respect to fatality rates, not even on scale. But we're much more sensitive now to the reality of what even small losses really look like. And we're attentive to how vulnerable populations are particularly targeted, in this case, by this current pandemic that we're experiencing. So I have a kind of robust hope. I think the data over the last 100 years is good evidence for hope. So I don't think hope is just a kind of inward state. I think it has outward markings that can be tracked. And I think there's good reason, not just faith, there's good reason to be hopeful.
Thank you. Go to the next question.
Another, sure. How does the contemplation of transcendence influence the creativeness or destructiveness of human nature? It's from Connie.
Could you repeat that question?
Sure, yeah.
I think I missed the first part of it.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
I'm kind of lifting so you can hear me. How does contemplation of transcendence influence the creativeness or destructiveness of human nature?
I mean, I can answer that based on some of the things I was talking about before, in the sense that if we think too much about our inherent transcendence, the part of us that is spirit that relates to God, we can mistake ourselves for being God and then enact all kinds of terrors on people. And so there's the destructive side. I think on the creative side, to say that we are also connected not only with ourselves, but with God, with each other, with the planet. There's a creative reality that goes on, and that again connects back with hope, that we are recreators after the transcendent, that we are ones who, we don't create de novo, but we take things and make new things out of them. And the promise that brings, I think, it brings a lot of positives out of that kind of reflection, the things that we could do and make and see, which brings us back to the last question about what we're actually capable of doing. And I'm not surprised. I don't think you have to be a theist or a Christian or whatever brand of theist you are to help make the world a better place, because I believe that that spirit is present in all humanity, and the dignity of the image of God is present in all humanity. So, you know, that Paul is a really good guy. It's not a surprise to me, you know, after this many years anyway. You know, so I think that's inherent in everybody. So when you contemplate transcendence, then it can lead to all kinds of creative encounters and things like that. I don't know if that helps. I don't know if you want to say anything.
I don't know if I have much of an answer to that question. I mean, I guess I'm attentive to, you know, the creative energy that sometimes can get unlocked when there's big cultural changes too. So if you think about different moments when things in music fundamentally change, think of Stravinsky and The Rite of Spring or something, which caused a riot in the Paris theater where it was first played in 1912. So you can also think how cultural changes, large scale changes, which we're seeing now with respect to, certainly in the developed West, with the decline, at least in participation rates with respect to religion, that shakes loose a lot of things. I think it's a huge transformation, and there are dangers in it too. And but from the artistic side, art often flourishes in moments of change as opposed to moments of continuity. So I don't think there's any inherent a downside with respect to creativity if there's a fundamental change in how we think about the transcendent.
I think the risk of the moment, if I could play off of that, though, is that, again, this idea that when you equate yourself with the transcendent, there's a great danger in that. And I think we have a danger in that in the present moment. And that can ultimately kill creativity, right? Is when there's one idea, one rule that, where's the diversity of creation then, and those kinds of things? If everything has to look the same, be the same, what do we do with diversity? And that could open up a whole other conversation. So I'll just leave it there. Yeah.
Go for the next one.
I can keep going until you tell me not to go anymore.
We'll go for a couple more.
I have a few more. This is a question for Paul. What type of experience of transcendence would be required to move from convictions of feelings of transcendence to convictions of experiencing real transcendence?
What kinds of
what kind of experience of transcendence would move across that line, I think, is the question.
Right. Well, of course, I'm denying that transcendence is real. So it's a real counterfactual question for me. I'm not quite sure what it'd be like saying to me, imagine 2 and 2 equaled 5. How would you do the arithmetic? I'm denying that transcendence is a real property. And I'm suggesting that with the decline of religion, the sort of ontological housing in which transcendence found a place is also disappearing. So I don't have for me, there's no relevant experience that evidences religious transcendence. If there were, I wouldn't be arguing against it. Yeah.
Here's another question for both of you. But Dr. Abela mentioned earlier about atheism leading to giving up the sense of being at home in the world. And I'd like to hear both of you comment on that, because I think many theists would agree with that statement. So maybe if Anna could begin with that, and then you could respond.
Yeah.
Dr. Robbins.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, of course, we know, I know so many people say the world is not my home. I'm just a passing through.
Right.
And I actually rail against that because I think we are part of the created order and we belong here, actually. I think that the creation, I've learned from my Indigenous friends that the creation looks after us. We don't just take care of the creation takes care of us. And so I think that is it a Christian asking the question? Because that kind of matters in a way. I don't think we are just a passing through. We're here for a reason, purpose, meaning, all of those kinds of things. So to say that we're not at home in the world, there's a yes and a no to it. There's a yes, we are. This is the place where we're put. It's where we're meant to be. We are material. We belong together. We're carbon like everything else, and all of that sort of thing. But there is a sense that this is not going to be like this forever. And I think we have to accept that reality and that disruption and that disjuncture that at some point will come at the point of our own death, whatever that looks like. And who knows, will the planet ever end? We don't know. But, apparently it's burning itself out another few billion years or something. But, there is that sense of things ending. So are we at home? Yes and no. I think if we just have this idea that we're just passing through, that's a view of eternity that I think Hagelin critiques, and I think he's right to critique it. This idea that things they'll just continue as they are forever. I think we delude ourselves with that. I don't think that's a view that is helpful, actually, and we need to be far more realistic as theists. That we want to deny. I think theists want to deny the immanent frame, right? And I think a human being is equally both the transcendent and the immanent together. And so, I just would want to reaffirm that side of it. I could go on and on. I'll shut up now.
No, I guess I'm sort of agreeing with the premise of the question. So I do think that there is no sense in which there's any fit between the best of being human and the character of reality. So the features that we can craft in the microcosm, the things that matter to us, we wrench from something entirely foreign to its nature, and we hold them for a temporary period. When we share that condition. In that sense, as I say, I think estrangement is, if you're trying to sort of think about our condition, estrangement is the condition that we find ourselves in, and that's a radical, to my mind at least, within the atheist traditions, a bit of a unique view about it. And I see it, I know, in a way, Anne and I share a kind of existential feel. She has it from the theistic angle, with including the immanent as well as the transcendent in the account. So there's always a existential feature in how Anna articulates the issue. And for me, it's entirely in the immanent, and to some degree that sort of existential feature is sort of 11 on the amp, as it were. And I think, as I say, within certain forms of scientific naturalism, which tend to dominate the contemporary atheist discussion, sometimes the sort of search for truth has a sense, again, of a smuggled in eternal transcendence, where, it was always, religion was just making it up as it went, but now we're really doing it. We're doing the real, dare I say it, transcendental thing. And I think that's a kind of, that the capital for that move is borrowed from the religious. And I think if you're within the immanent frame, you need to give that up too. Not the hunt for truth, not for truths that are practical, not for crafting vaccines, not for all the real tangible things that are part of building up this microcosm that we can craft, this safe harbor in a hostile environment. All of those things are what give our commitments value. So I'm sort of affirming that, but I don't think any of that ever adds back up to this eternal notion of the transcendent. And I think there are some scientifically minded naturalists who, and I know this peculiar kind of irony, given that they're atheists, but they smuggle in at least the scent of that transcendental feel within their veneration of science. And I think an honest naturalism, completely divorced from the religious impulse, has to give that up.
Maybe one more if we have.
No further questions.
Oh, well, perfect. Great time. So, thank you both. And to those of you that came in person and online, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And again, Paul and Anna, thank you very much for a very enlightening and inspiring discussion. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dale.
Thanks so much, Dale. Thank you.